Hello and welcome to the DBS Institute YouTube channel. I'm DC Breaks, and in this three-part masterclass production series, I'll be creating this melodic dance floor drum and bass tune entirely from scratch in Ableton Live. And when I say from scratch, I really mean it, because absolutely everything in this track is going to start life as one of these, a simple pure sine wave. So for this project, I'm only going to be using Live's bundled plugins, freely available Max for Live devices and other third-party plugins. I'm going to cover a lot of fundamental sound design principles, some really powerful workflow techniques, lots and lots of production tips, and of course I'll share some of these powerful free tools with you to enhance your own music productions. Now, over the course of this series, I'll show you how to use a sine wave initially to generate other more complex waveforms, and then how you can use these for designing a complete set of drums, including kicks, snares, cymbals, hi-hats, toms, bongos, and then how you can process all of that into a full beat. We'll look at designing bass sounds, leads, melodic parts and effects, including chords, arps, pads, drones, risers, and a whole bunch more. And then finally, we'll look at some workflow strategies for composing and arranging a track and getting it up to modern standards of loudness for drum and bass. So, without further ado, let's jump on in. Okay, so before I begin, I'm just going to explain in a bit more detail how this particular conceptual framework or set of rules is going to work that I'm going to be using. So essentially, I'm going to be building everything up from a single oscillation of a pure sine wave. I'm not going to be doing any live synthesis or anything like that. I'm just going to sample a pure sine wave and then build everything from that. I'm going to save everything into this folder, which I've called sine, within the user library. That'll allow me to save my individual waveforms I'm going to be making, any kind of racks and processing, and essentially that's going to build up a palette from which I can then write the tune later on. I'm only going to be using Live 11 stock plugins, and also some free plugins, for example, some Max for Live devices perhaps, and also this free effects bundle from Melder, particularly the oscilloscope and analyzer, so that you can see as well as hear what's going on as I start to build up all the tones and audio for this track. So let's begin, and the first thing of course I need to do is to get my pure sine wave. Now there's lots of different ways we could approach this, and depending on how strictly you're following your rules, you might choose one way or the other. So for example, if I come into analog, which is an analog synthesizer within Live, just choose oscillator 1, sine wave, no filter, and then in the amp section I'm just going to turn off the velocity sensitivity and play a note. We can see we've got a C3 here. I'm just going to turn on normalize. You can see that more clearly. There you go. It's 130.8 hertz. It is detuned by 1 cent, but we're not too worried about that perhaps. But if we look at the analyzer, you'll see as well as the pure fundamental tone, our C3 here, we've also got these additional harmonics, and that's because analog models analog synthesizers, and they tend to color sound by adding these additional harmonics. It makes things sound sort of richer and a bit more organic perhaps. It's also detuned slightly, but that's not what we want from the perspective of this project. So by contrast, if I came into operator and just turn off all the other layers, just use a single layer, a sine wave, once again just going to turn off the velocity sensitivity, turn off the filter, that same C3 is completely pure, and you can see it's completely tuned correctly. So that's the one that I'm going to go with for this project. Let's just record a tiny bit of that. Whoops, it might help if I record on the right track. Okay, we don't need the MIDI clip. Let's just zoom in and take a look at our sine wave. So I'm just going to turn up the gain on the clip first, so it's a bit easier to see what's going on. Okay, so here we have our sine wave, and if I zoom, I'm just going to very roughly chop this for a second, just to get rid of everything else. If we zoom in really far, we start to see the individual samples, and I'm working at 44.1, so there's going to be 44,100 samples taken in every second of audio, and I could choose to increase this if I wanted to get a slightly more accurate result, but it looks as though we've got a zero crossing there, so I'm just going to cut that there and come along to the end here and find again where it crosses zero. It looks as though it's probably about there. Okay, now I might be slightly off by the smallest margin, and that may affect our sound. We'll see in just a moment, because the next thing I'm going to do is obviously loop this so that I can produce my own pure sine note rather than just an individual hit. So to do that, I'm just going to come into Instruments, grab a sampler. I'm going to rename this sine wave C3. Oops, let's get this right. It's quite important to keep everything organized, because otherwise we're going to lose track of everything very quickly. So I'm going to put this in my sine folder. I'm actually going to create a new folder called waveforms, because I'm going to almost certainly want to build some other ones. And then in my sampler, I'm going to drag in my tone here and turn on sustain mode so that I can loop it. And let's see what we got. There we go. Now I only missed it by a tiny amount because it's slightly, the frequency is slightly too fast. So I must have just missed off a little bit on one side or the other, but that is very, very close. And I can handle that by just detuning it back down by -1. So now I have a pure sine tone, and I can use this to start building other waveforms and also start designing sounds. Okay, so to make sure we stay organized, I'm just going to rename this, just going to get rid of the name tag essentially, and then just drag this into my sine folder. I'm going to create a new folder here and call it samplers. And I'm going to put my sine wave in there because we're going to be using this a lot later on. And at this point, I now need to think about, well, what other sort of waveforms might I need? And the next one I'm going to be building is a square wave. Now this is very straightforward. We're going to also be building some more less straightforward waveforms. So we'll start with this one because it's nice and easy. So I just need to come into Audio Effects, Drive and Color, and pick out Saturator. I'm going to slap this down here, and then I'm going to turn up the drive and put it onto a hard curve, something like that, without any color. I'm just going to turn the master down a bit because this could be a little bit noisy, but let's have a listen to how that sounds. I do apologize, very loud. Now we can see there that it's a square, but it's a bit rounded off, and you can see that that's because we've got a hard curve here. If we choose something like a digital clip, you can hear and see that it looks slightly differently. So how we do this will really kind of shape what kind of square wave we're getting. We can look at some other types as well, and maybe just choose one that we think is sort of closest to what we want. I think the digital clip was pretty good. So let's say we're going to go with that one for now. So all I'm going to do once again is come to my resampling lane, hit record and sample that one. And then exact same process, just going to take a little section. Once again, just turn it up so we can see a bit more clearly what we're doing here. Now, a square wave, as you obviously will understand, theoretically goes from sort of peak to peak with absolutely a straight line. But of course, that, if you try to play that back on a set of speakers, would mean that the cone has to go from one position to the next instantaneously, and of course that's physically impossible. So what we have here is a sort of an approximation of a square wave, and you'll see, for example, as the wave comes up, it kind of bobbles around a little bit. But that's absolutely fine, because that's essentially the same kind of thing as we would have if we were playing it a square wave from a synthesizer. In fact, we wouldn't want a pure, sort of theoretically pure square wave, because it wouldn't sound very good at all, and our speakers wouldn't be able to handle it. So once again, we're just going to find that zero crossing. And it may not be exactly where the sample is, but that doesn't actually matter. Let's rename this square wave, also a C3. And then we're going to create a new sampler. So I'm just going to duplicate this one and put our square wave into this one. Turn off the saturator. I can delete that. And now if we have a look, I forgot to crop that actually, so we can just do that here. Let's have a look and see what we've got here. And as you'll see, it has a range of harmonics going all the way up. So essentially, a square wave is just a set of pure tone sine waves in a particular harmonic series, which I'm not going to go into now, going all the way up through the spectrum. And of course it has that kind of richer, buzzier sound. So again, not a perfectly pure square wave, not that you would want that, but we now have a different kind of fundamental building block that we can use in our tune. And that will produce different tones and be useful for different situations, which we'll see later on. So we're going to save that, and we're going to come back to our user library and dump that into our samplers. Now, you might be wondering, what is the point of taking this approach? And it's a valid question, because you could easily synthesize a sine wave or a square wave or any kind of complex waveform that you like very easily. But the point is that doing this is going to force us to think about how sound works. We're going to have to understand how things like harmonics work. We're going to have to look at how we can creatively solve some problems to get the types of sounds we need. And in doing that, we're going to learn a lot about sound design. It's going to make us better producers. And we're going to build up this amazing palette of sounds all from this one sine wave that we can use to make music. And then if we keep that workflow going over a long period of time, we'll eventually have this vast library of sounds that we've sculpted from the very, very bare bones of audio itself, a pure sine tone. Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying the content. Just to let you know that we offer online courses in a range of creative subjects. So if you're interested in taking your skills and knowledge to the next level, check out the link below. Now, the next thing I want to do in this project is to generate some kind of noise. Now, white noise, and there's lots of different styles of noise, white noise is all the frequencies in the spectrum playing at random with equal intensity. We can see and hear what that looks like in Operator. If we just choose the white noise generator, make sure there's no filtering or any other processing going on. And if we look at the oscilloscope, we can see it's just random peaks and troughs with no discernible pitch. So it's atonal, doesn't have a distinctive tone. And if we look in the analyzer, we can see across the spectrum it's completely equal, albeit at random, and it's equal intensity across all the frequencies. So to do that, we need to take our sine wave, have it playing at random across all the frequencies in the spectrum, and we should be able to start to approximate something like white noise. So we'll keep Operator there so we can reference back to see how we're getting on. But essentially what I'm going to be doing now is taking our sine wave tone, and then in our MIDI clip, I'm going to be triggering lots of different individual tones. We can kind of see that these are all at different places. These are all really pitched down and low, and you'll see why that is in a minute. And there's 32 of these because sampler is limited to 32 voices maximum. So we want 32 voices on. And now what I need to do is to modulate the pitch of the sine wave so that it's not just playing or each note's not just playing one particular tone. So if we come into modulation, turn on LFO 1, make it a random LFO, and we'll whack the frequency up so that randomization occurs as fast as it can. And then we're just going to assign that to pitch. We'll do the same thing with LFO 2. Routing works a little bit different here in that we just need to assign it to the pitch. You can't have the same thing on two different sends, so we're going to use pitch and pitch sample only. And whack that up to 100, and same thing on oscillator 3. And this is just to give it the most amount of pitch that we can squeeze out of sampler in terms of modulation. So crank that up, crank that up, crank that up. Now if we have a listen, we can hear what it sounds like. So it sounds like a kind of broken computer effect. And so because we're limited to 32 notes per instance, I'm just going to duplicate this, take these 32 clips here and 32 notes, put them up to the next available slot, duplicate that again, move them up once more, like so, and once more. Something like that, and keep going until we've got all the available frequencies that we can get. Where are we going into now? There. A little bit fiddly, and I might not have got this perfect. It doesn't really matter because it's going to be spitting these notes out at random. Okay, so I think we've gone up as high as we can go. Just want to check that these are actually, no, I put these outside the clip. Okay, and then just for the sake of tidiness, I'm just going to group these guys together. I'm going to turn this down because it's probably going to come out really loud, and we can hear what we got. And voila, something that approximates white noise. So let's just get these out of the way a little bit. Okay, so on our group here, we'll call this white noise. It's not actually technically white noise, but it approximates white noise. We can see that ours is actually skewed a lot more to the low end. We need more going on in the kind of top end. So we could kind of go through and sort of fiddle around with the sine waves and the kind of the way the modulation is working, if you like. But I'm just going to take an EQ8, put it onto the group, and then select, turn it on 8 and put on a high shelf. Okay, that's roughly where I want it to be. I'm just going to get another one, duplicate that, and group those together. And just duplicate those again. And the more we do this, the more we're going to get something that approximates white noise. Okay, just give it one more. Struggling a little bit now because we've got so many voices playing. Okay, we've reached the point at which live is not going to enjoy that, so I'm just going to undo that step. And now we're going to come into resampling, and we're going to resample that. Okay, so we can turn that off now. And we have our white noise. So once again, just going to rename this white noise. Again, it's not like exactly theoretical white noise, but it's pretty close. I'm going to just increase the gain on that so we've got a bit more of a louder signal. I'm going to consolidate that and chuck it into our waveforms folder. Okay, so now we have our sine wave, our square wave, and some white noise. And the next one I want to do before we actually start making some sounds is to design a sawtooth wave using sine waves. So this is a little bit trickier. I'm going to have to come up with a slightly creative technique in order to do that. So let's take a look at how we can make a sawtooth using a sine wave. Okay, so to make a saw wave from a sine wave, I'm going to be using a technique called wave shaping. And I'm going to be dipping into the Melder effects again, the free bundle, and using the wave shaper tool. And essentially what this allows us to do is to distort an input and mathematically alter it essentially to get a different output. So we have our classic sine wave here. And if I use this on 100% wet, we can start to move these points around, and you'll see that as I do that, the output changes. Now I'm just going to turn the output down a bit because this can get a little bit loud. So there's a square wave, for example. That might be another way of generating a square wave. And if I right click here, we can create all sorts of different shapes and do all sorts of different things. But I'm just going to insert a simple point to start with and create a shape, something like that. And you can see we've got our saw wave there, albeit back to front, but actually the phase doesn't really matter. And there's a way of handling that as well, which we'll look at in just a second. But otherwise, we can just kind of finesse this until we get something that's kind of that classic sawtooth shape. That'll do there. Okay, so just going to hit record. And now we've got our sawtooth bounce down over here. Just turn the clip gain up a little bit so we can see what we're doing. So yeah, it's really just this little section from here through to here that we're interested in. So just going to zoom in once again, find the crossover point, something like that. And then chop it again around here, looks like there. Okay. And then because it's back to front, it doesn't really matter, but I'm just going to reverse it. That's kind of the more traditional looking view. And then I'm just going to rename this as saw and consolidate it. And then once again, just save it back to our library. So now we have 4 of the most, I guess, fundamental building blocks that we can use to do all our sound design. We've got our saw, our sine, a square, and some white noise. So from here, we're going to be turning attention now to sound design and looking at how we can use these individual components to start making some actual usable elements for our track. Okay, so now that we have the fundamental components of our sounds, the different waveforms, we can now start to design some sounds. I'm going to start with the drums. I'm going to start by making a kick. So I'm going to come into instruments. I'm going to use simpler for this. I'm going to come back into my use library and grab the sine wave. This needs to be looped, of course, as before. And once again, we now have pure sine tone. And what I'm going to do is just start drawing in a basic pattern. Now, our note is normally at C3. But with this being a drum bass track, I'm going to be working in F. So I'm going to bring this down and put it on F1, which is about 44 Hertz. And that's going to be essentially the fundamental tone of our kick drum. But of course, a kick isn't just made up of sub bass, it has different layers. So I'm going to group it, and then I'm going to let's call this one the fundamental. If I now duplicate that and rename this, call this one body, I just pitch this body up an octave. And then I'm also going to bring in I'm going to duplicate this again and bring in some white noise instead. Now, what we need to do from this point is to shape each layer of the kick. So our fundamental, really the kind of low sub bass bit, we want to just use the amplitude envelope just to back off the initial attack. And we don't want it to be sustained very much. And similarly with the body, I'm going to take a similar kind of approach because the kind of initial impact, let's call this transient. So the kick, the beta of the kick drum hitting the skin, effectively that's kind of tends to be like quite noisy. That's why we're going to use our white noise. And this needs to be a very short, snickety kind of short sound. So I'm just going to solo each of these. So we've got, it's probably a bit too short. Something like that. Then we've got our body, which almost sounds like a tom. And then the thud of the kick, the low end. And when you put them all together, we get something like this. Now, it doesn't sound much like a kick at the moment, but that is the kind of the crux of the sound. And so all I'm going to do now is just kind of reshape the tone a little bit. But before I do that, I'm just going to run everything through a couple of different effects. So I'm going to use the drum bus, which is in driving color here. Turn up the crunch, tune the boom to the 44 Hertz that we've got on our F there. We can see it actually tells us what the frequency is down here. So get it right onto F, 43.6. It's actually 43.8, I think, but that was close enough. Turn up the transients. And now I'm just going to use the gain of the different layers to kind of balance that out a bit. So the body's a bit loud at the moment. And maybe play around with the envelopes a bit as well. Okay, I'm going to run everything through a saturator as well, just to kind of glue it all together a bit. Not too much. And then that really is essentially the basics of our kick. we might want to process that further, but we're going to leave that there for now, and we're going to save this as our kick. So just call this kick. And we're going to group all of this together. Sorry, rename that one kick. There we go. And we're going to put that into our library. So I'm going to create a new folder now. I'm going to call this one drums, and then we'll just stick it in there for now. We may end up designing a few more. There we go. Now we have our kick. Now, one of the ways that we could make this kind of process this to make it a bit more realistic sounding and a bit sort of more aggressive and a bit faster and punchier and all those kinds of things is to use some distortion. So I'm going to insert an effects rack here, or start adding effects and create a rack of distortion, and use that to generate different tonalities for our kick. So what I mean by that is, if I come into effects, let's take just a bunch at random here. Let's go with those 4 for now. I'm going to group those together, and then what I can do is start to assign or map different parameters to the macros. So we'll just do them one by one. So we've got our dynamic tube here. Let's try driving it. So I'm just going to map the dry wet to macro 1. Let's do the same now with erosion. This time I'm going to map the amount to macro 2. Let's do the same with overdrive. Okay, just working fairly quickly at this point, and you'll see why shortly. And likewise with the saturator, let's try a wave shape this time. And again, map that one to macro 4. I can get rid of the others for now. And so just to give you an idea of workflow, if we now just turn these back on, and actually with the last one, I just want to tweak the amount. So a lot of these we don't necessarily want them at 100%. We want to only have them something like that. And you'll see why now, because what I'm going to do is hit random. If I just make this a bit bigger, actually, you can see this is the random button here. And by hitting random, I'm getting different random amounts of different types of distortion, which are all helping to colour our sound. So let's say, like that one, I can now come in here and create a snapshot. Let's call this one kick 1. Let's have another one there, kick 2. And so we can go on like that, and we can very quickly build up some different types of distortion. So I'm going to call this distortion 1. And once again, I can save this into my library. So I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this distortions, and I'm going to put distortion in there. Okay. So now we may come back and use this and apply it for other sounds a bit later on, and this is going to help us to build up our library of sounds a bit more quickly. Okay, so this kick's sounding okay, but it's sounding a little synthetic still, perhaps lacking in a bit of energy and punch. So one thing we can do to try and address that is to add some pitch envelope into it as well. So this is what we've got at the moment. So I'm going to turn on the pitch envelope. So with and without. Just adds a certain level of kind of excitement to it. We'll do the same thing with the body part as well. And the other thing we might want to do is look at something like multiband dynamics. So one thing that you can do is bring some excitement into a synthetic drum like this by using upward expansion, which is something that most people don't use very often when they're producing music. And all I'm going to do is for each band, set the threshold to where the signal's just kind of poking in and then adjust the ratio to kind of bring up the different parts of the band dynamically. Got to be very careful not to clip everything, so I'm just going to keep turning stuff down so that we're not getting a clip at the output stage. So without. Now it may be doesn't sound as good because I turned the output down, but it actually sounds a bit punchier. Bit more energetic as well. Okay, and at this point, you know, we haven't EQ'd it or done anything else like that, but this is in the ballpark of where I'd kind of want it to be. And again, we can play around with some different distortions and what have you later on. But at the moment, this is sounding decent enough for us to start perhaps recording. So if we just come up to the resampling tab. At this point as well, having it in audio can help us identify any potential issues. But essentially, this is what most kicks look like. We have a bit of high energy, kind of atonal noise, if you like, at the beginning here. We might want to look at improving this transient actually. It could be perhaps a bit cleaner, but there's some good stuff kind of going on in there. And then we have this kind of classic, quite clean sine shape tailing away. If we have this, you know, too long at this point, we might identify, okay, well, we need to shorten it down. And just having everything in audio can help us kind of tidy everything up. We can put fades in and stuff if we need to as well. But for now, let's call this kick 1, nice and imaginative, and put this into our library. So I'm going to need to create a new folder now. I'm going to call this drum samples. And I might even create a new folder within this called kicks and start to build up a selection of kicks. Because, you know, when you're making the tune, maybe you feel like the kick doesn't fit and you might want to try a few different variations. So very easily now we can come in, we can randomize our distortions, play around with things, you know, and try out some different style kicks. But for now, let's leave it there. We've got a good workflow for doing that and move on and design some snares. Okay, let's turn our attention to designing a snare next. And the snare is very similar, in fact, to the kick. And all it's really doing is a similar thing, but in a different pitch. So I'm just going to take our kick, which if you remember is down here at F1, 44 Hertz or so, and we're just going to pitch this up 2 octaves so that our fundamental is around 175. F3. Okay, so it's still in tune with the rest of our song that's going to be in F. And what we need to really do now is to take the shape of it and mold it to be more in line with that of a typical snare. I've just seen that this is actually not where I want it. Let's keep it there. Okay, and so really that just means having it shorter. So I'm just going to bring down the decay. We still need our transient, but we also need to recreate the effect of the snares themselves. So the snares is the bits of metal, if you like, that sit underneath the snare and rattle around when you hit the snare with a stick. So we're going to be using, once again, the white noise. Let's just rename this, call it snare. And whereas our transient is really short, we just want this to be quite a bit longer. Something like that. So our snare now sounds something like this. So just with a few minor tweaks, we've ended up with something that sounds pretty close to a snare, whereas moments ago it just sounded more like a kick. But the problem we have often with synthetic snares, unless that's the sound you're kind of going for, if you want to create more kind of like a drum machine style drum, that's absolutely fine. But if you want to make it sound a bit more realistic, we need to think about how we can creatively do that. And one of the ways we can do that is to focus on this snare element, because at the moment it just sounds like kind of noise. And in the real world, of course, it has a bit more going on than just being white noise. So one of the ways we can do that is to come into audio effects, come to our reverbs and resonances and choose corpus. And I'm just going to put this onto just this snare layer rather than the whole snare drum that we're designing. And what this does is it models the resonances associated with different types of objects. We've got a beam, marimba, and so on and so forth. And for snares, membranes and plates work quite well. And in the interest of saving time, we can use a preset. There's nothing wrong with that. So let's try the bright snare preset, for example. Let's try it without and then with, and you'll hear what a difference that can make in terms of livening up this noise and making it sound more realistic. The other thing we can do is to give it some traditional reverb, if you like. And the hybrid reverb is a convolution reverb. That means it uses something called an IR, an impulse response, to model realistic spaces. And again, we can use a preset. Let's go for something like snare plate digital vintage. See how that sounds. And once again, just bring in a little bit of this on the snare part of this drum. Might be a little long, so we can bring the decay time down. We can EQ this response as well. And you can hear how this can have quite a dramatic effect on the sound if we want it to. So we can make it sort of brighter or give it more kind of body in the middle here as well. Without going too far into it, that sounds pretty good to me. And then we can also process more of the whole sound altogether. So I've already looked at dynamic and multiband dynamics. We might want to just adjust the balance of this to be better suited to a snare, whereas it was set up really to kind of work with a kick before. And really the main considerations here is that at the moment the low band is too low or lower than our fundamentals. So if we just bring this up, we can manage everything kind of in the low mids of this snare sound. So you might hear how that's adjusting it. Probably a bit much. And now, because it's a lot brighter, a lot more of the signals being pushed above the threshold and being boosted accordingly. So we just need to dial that back a bit. Okay, and then finally, something else we might like to consider is using a transient shaper. And I'm going to dip into a Max for Live plugin called Transient Designer. And this is going to be shaping the whole transient shape, if you like, of this whole snare. So I'm just going to bring the output down because I'm going to be adding gain. And once again, I don't want this to be distorting over here. So without. So just very subtle adjustments there has really added some snap to it, but also brought out the tail. And so we can kind of, depending on the snare we're making, tweak some of these attack and release times and so on. But generally, that sounds pretty good. So I'm pretty happy with that. And again, you know, you can tweak and tweak and tweak all this kind of stuff to your heart's delight if you want. But for me, that sounds pretty good right now. So all I'm going to do is just get rid of these guys, bring it all back down. I'm going to group the lot. And we're going to call this one snare. We're going to put this back into our library. So sine drums. There we go. And while I'm here, going to record a couple as well. So again, once again, now that we're in audio, we can jump in and see it's maybe clipping a tiny little bit. Yeah, you can see that one's squared off a bit. So I might need to go in and just bring the signal down. And that's another good reason to kind of have a look at these things in audio. Okay. We can always turn the gain up on this, you see, and now it's not clipping. So once again, in audio, we have the ability to, you know, possibly shorten this down a little bit. If the tail's kind of dragging on too long, it's a bit easier than trying to fine tune things at the kind of sampler level. We can just bring the gain up into the ballpark. It doesn't have to be exactly all the way up. And we might choose to do some further processing of that later on. And particularly when we come to start actually making a tune and mixing it, you know, these are going to probably change again depending on how the tune's going. But for now, let's rename that snare 1, consolidate it, and now we can put that back into our library, into our drum samples folder. Okay, so let's go to new folder, snares, and pop that guy in there. And so now we have a really good workflow for designing our snares. We can come back in and once again play around with some randomness if we want to give ourselves some different variations. And we can obviously play around with other elements of the shape of it using the transient designer and what have you. But for now, let's leave it there and move on and look at designing some other percussion. Okay, so moving on, we're going to look now at designing some cymbals. And the workflow is actually quite similar to the way that we've been designing our other drums. We just made a snare. And so now all I'm going to be doing is taking our snares and pitching them up. It's going to be quite loud, so I'm just going to turn this down. And what we don't want is that really high-pitched sine wave that we can hear in there. So that's the fundamental. We're going to take that off, and we just want this to be mostly noise. Now, in one of the first videos, I looked at how I made noise using sine waves, and it wasn't actually pure white noise that I made. Pure white noise has no tonality whatsoever, but we can actually hear that this noise actually does have some tonality in it. As I pitch it down, you'll hear it changes. And actually that's a bit of an advantage in this situation because we actually want our cymbal sound to have some tonality. You can tune cymbals, they have different frequencies and it's not just pure noise. So that's actually a bit of an advantage here. So let's get rid of our fundamental. We want to just rename this, I'll call it cymbal rather than snare. And we just need to now change the shape of our cymbal by making it a bit longer actually. So we can just drag this out. But it does still sound kind of like noise. So the first thing I want to do is actually to remove a little bit of the low frequency content. I can use a different model that allows me to add drive to bring out a bit of character and perhaps a bit of resonance as well. Depending on how aggressive you want to go with that. But it still sounds quite noisy. So what I want to do is to make it a bit more realistic. And once again, we're going to use the corpus reverb to simulate some material resonance. And I can use a hot swap and just pick up one that I like, which is the metallic reso. And that's what this sounds like. You can hear straight away this now sounds much more like a metallic object being struck. I'm not going to have it fully wet so that I get a little bit of that noise to kind of get that transient bite at the beginning there. And then we can also look to shape this and make it a bit more realistic by using some modulation. So if you imagine a hi-hat cymbal, when it's initially struck, it has that first initial bite of energy, which is our transient essentially. And then it's kind of vibrating very fast, and then as the energy dissipates, it kind of settles back down to being completely still. And we can simulate that or model that using the LFO in Sampler. So the LFO we're going to use is a sine wave, and we're going to assign it to the volume. And if I put this up really fast and bring it down, you should hear, if I make this particularly long as well, that the volume is going up and down very quickly. So I'm actually going to use something tied to the grid so it's really consistent each time. And of course, we don't necessarily want to hear that right away, so we can back that off with the attack here so that it's kind of doesn't have that oscillation and then it kind of comes in. So it's quite subtle, and you just want to be listening to the end of the cymbal now. And we can do a similar thing with the pitch. So once again, I'll turn it up to 100, make it long so you can really hear it, and then just look to back that off a bit. So that should sound quite a bit more natural than it did to start with. We can shape the overall shape of it with the transient designer. We could also do our old trick of randomizing distortions to get sort of different tonalities for it as well. So that's quite cool. I think the volume effect's a bit much there, so I'm just going to back it off from 100%. Something like that. And when we're happy with it, we can just go ahead and record one or two. So there we have it. We have one of our cymbals. So let's just go ahead and take that one. Again, just bringing the gain up because I had it down so I didn't deafen you all when I was playing around with that stuff. We can, now that it's in audio, very easily shape the tail of it as well if we want to kind of tidy those things up. But for now, let's call that one cymbal 1. Always do that with cymbal 1. There we go. Consolidate it and then add that back into our library in the relevant folder. So I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this one tops, and then I can put that cymbal into my tops. And then we can use the same workflow to design a hi-hat. So a hi-hat is very similar in some ways. It's just a lot shorter, it tends to be a lot shorter. So let's just try and model that now. I'm going to bring down the amount of this metallic resonance, make it a bit more noisy. Perhaps try some different distortion. Still a bit metallic there. Okay, and then maybe just use the transient designer to make it a bit shorter. There we go, that'll do, that's one. Let's go ahead and record that. There we go. And once again, just bring the gain up on that. Put a little fade in, rename it, and consolidate it and chuck it into our library. And so we now have a workflow for designing cymbals and hats as well. I'm going to just save all of that because although it's very, very similar to our snare one, I'm just going to rename this cymbals, and then I can put that into my drums folder here so that later on, if we want to make some more cymbals, I can just pull that up and it'll already be programmed and set up ready to do that. So we've got some hi-hats, we've got some cymbals, kicks and snares. Let's go ahead now and make some other percussion and look at making some bongos. Okay, let's make some bongos. Very similar to our workflow for making snares. And because we're being really organized, we can just come and get our snare rack from our library. And what we need to do, I'm just going to turn this down in case it's a bit too loud. We're going to have these guys down several octaves. Let's try it down around F4. Get rid of our cymbals. Of course, that now still sounds like a snare because it is. But what we're going to be doing, we don't want really that snare effect that we had before. We just really want the fundamental. Okay, that sounds a little bit like a bongo. Not particularly realistic. So once again, we're going to come into audio effects and grab another corpus. And the material I want to model here is the tube, because if you think about a bongo, it's like a drum suspended above a tube. And the great advantage of this one is that we can tune it as well. So we want a very short decay time by moving this to the left. Let's just hear how that sounds. Something like that. Let's add a little bit of realistic reverb as well using the hybrid reverb. Let's just grab a preset to start with. Fat Drum Studio sounds good. And voila, we have a bongo. Let's record that one while we're here. Okay, let's just call that, let's grab that one there and rename that Bongo 1. And so again, working quite quickly, we can just chuck this into our drum samples folder. We're going to need a new subfolder. We'll call it percussion or perk. Let's go ahead and make some more. One thing we can do as well, we can play around with the tuning here. We can play around with the tuning of the fundamental using the pitch envelope again. That can create quite different effects. Can try some different distortions. Let's try a different tuning here. Okay, let's record that. Might want a slightly longer tail on this one. And so we can go along like that, just effectively making different variations, and we can spend a bit of time doing that. And once again, then just build up our library to add into our big sort of folder here. And then accordingly, we can then build up a big library of sounds we can use when it comes to composition. Okay, let's move on quickly then and just cover making toms. I'm going to be using my kick sampler for this, as they're most closely aligned to the sound of a tom. You can think of a kick as a big tom, or a tom's a small kick if you like. And so all we need to do is to grab our notes and pop them somewhere an octave or two above our kicks. There we go, straight away that sounds quite tomish. So we don't really need to do too much with this. We could try using corpus once again to get something that sounds a bit more resonant. Let's try the tube again, see how that goes. That works pretty well. And once again, we could try some different distortions to get some different tonalities, but for now, let's just quickly record that one. Maybe come in. That's quite beefy. Let's take that one as well. So we'll just grab this guy here, consolidate it, turn him up. Rename him Tom 1. Pop him into our drum samples folder. He can go in percussion as well. Let's grab this one. Make sure I get the tail. There we go. And it may be that we end up processing these again a bit further, but for now, let's just keep this simple. And in it goes. Okay, so now we've made pretty much all the different drum elements, or at least one variety. And what I'll do at some point in the future is go through and just design a whole bunch more so that I've got a bigger palette to work with. But essentially that's the process for designing all of your drums from the fundamental starting point of just using a sine wave. So now, having done that, we can start to program a beat and look at how we can use some of the plugins in Live to process that to make some drum breaks. So using the workflows that we've covered so far, I've designed a whole bunch more hits, different kicks and snares and things like that. And we've got these in our drum samples folder as ALC, so Ableton Live clip files as well. We can preview these even though they're not sort of traditional WAV files or anything like that. And the great thing about this file format is that it enables us to also store processing on these as well. So you can see this one I've just dragged in here has this drum bus already on it, which is kind of helping to really give it some extra weight. Let's have a quick look around this kick before we kind of go ahead and process the beat and just check that it's kind of in the right ballpark for what we're looking for. So looking at it, you can see, first of all, it's short, which is good, particularly for dancefloor drum and bass. You don't want long kind of tails on your kicks because that'll interfere with the sub. We're going to cover that later on, how to manage that. And it's kind of like a triangle shape. And this indicates that this is a kind of a short, punchy kind of style kick. So that's quite a good thing to aim for, this kind of triangle shape. Looking a bit more closely though, you can see the transient isn't really there. If this was a lot kind of darker and fuzzier in the same way that we've seen in previous examples, that would indicate there's more kind of noise and harmonic richness going on in that first bit. It's a bit just kind of straight sub at the moment for my liking. And you can kind of see that in the oscilloscope as well. There's not too much harmonic content being displayed. So let's just quickly fix that. And one thing I would like to maybe do is to duplicate down our kick, and then using beats mode in just a forward transient loop mode, pitch this up a couple of octaves to get a really kind of zappy pitched up kick, and then layer this in with our existing kick. Now, if we hit record arm on our resampling lane, we can see what that does. And it's kind of at the moment destroyed the kick because it's summing the two and it's not really kind of producing like a clean result. So what I'm going to do first of all is I'm just going to run off the pitched up kick first. There we go. So what's happening there is that this is summing with this, and we're getting a lot of weird interference, and it's too loud and it's just messing up the kick. So what we really want to do, if we bring this back to this lane here, is just to kind of manage the bits that we want and the bits that we don't want. So we don't want this to be really much longer than about there, I would say. You can kind of see that, in fact, it's a lot shorter than that, actually. So you can see where the kind of transient was or should have been up to about there. So let's just fade that out a little bit like that, and then fade this in. And we can kind of tweak that a little bit. So now that should be a lot less kind of forced. And actually, they were both a bit loud, so let's just turn them back down so we can kind of see what we're doing here. So now we can see a lot more clearly that transient, but we've lost a little bit of weight here. You can see this is really loud and this is kind of a bit quiet. So to fix that, we can just hit record again, and then in our resampling lane, see what we're getting as we adjust the different levels. So let's just turn down that transient a bit. Let's turn up the body, and you can start to see that we're getting something that's a bit better balanced, and hopefully you should be able to hear that as well. Something like that. Again, it's a bit loud, so I'm just going to bring both the levels down an equal amount now and re-record that. And we've ended up with something like that. So let's just say that that's going to be good for us. Let's call that kick 12. Let's consolidate it, chuck it into our folder here. I like to get rid of the date information, otherwise it tends to look a bit long. And then let's just get a nice clean lane, a new audio track with no processing on it, and put our kick in there. Okay, so we now have our kick. Now, before we go ahead and kind of program the beat, I want to try and get this as loud and as kind of clean as I can, essentially. So What I want to do is auto gain stage it and then clip it in order to do that. And that's just really to extract as much loudness as I can out of this sample, so that when it comes to mixing, I've got like a bass level to kind of work from. So if I come to my plugins folder, I'm going to be using the TB Pro Audio DP Meter plugin, which is free. And what this does is it listens to your signal here and measures it for all kinds of different types of loudness. It's a loudness meter, essentially. But if you put in a reference level here, and let's go for 0 dB full scale, and using these little M's, we can match the audio to different loudness levels. And the one we're interested in really is the peak maximum. We don't want it to go, we want it to go up to the peak, but not over it. So if we just match the loudness now, you can see it's added 1.4 dB of gain. If I was to take the sample and turn it down a bunch, like so, and do it again, it's now having to add 3.2 dB of gain to get it back up to a reference level of 0. So if we were to just check that, we could just come up here and hit record. You can see that that is, basically as loud as it can go, mainly because this transient is the loudest part here. You can see it's hitting 0 at that point there, actually, but it's not clipping. So it might be that if we were really being finicky about this, we'd go in and maybe reduce the level of the transient there so that we could bring up the level of the rest of it, the body, if we wanted to. But we're going to do something else, which is to now clip this sample. And we can do that kind of transparently. So there is a clipper within Logic, within Live, sorry, but I'm going to use a third-party one by a company called Kazrog. It's called K-Clip Zero. Again, it's a free plugin. It produces a pretty transparent sound. It's not bad considering it's free. It's not the best one out there, and it has this slightly annoying and useless and slow GUI, or sort of graphical readout. So there's a way to kind of handle this, but essentially what we want to do is now turn up the gain until it doesn't sound, or when it's kind of on the threshold of still sounding how it sounds now, but without distorting. So we can go ahead and do that. And if I push it really hard, you can hear it starting to sound really flabby. Now, one of the problems in doing this is that we're not doing this really very transparently, because it is just getting louder and louder and louder. And the way that our ears work is that they tend to prefer the loudness of the sample rather than necessarily the tonality. So it might sound better even though it's just louder. So a way to kind of get around that is to use one of our Melder plugins. And so we've got this Magic one here. Again, this is a free plugin. And what this does is if you route the sidechain input to be the same as the audio channel that we're on, which is this one here, it will kind of, and let me just double check that it's the right channel. Yeah, 4 kick, here we go, track 4. It will listen to the signal at the start of the chain, and then it will automatically turn down the gain to kind of negate any processing that kind of goes on. So let's just bring this back to 0, and I'll show you what I mean. So at the moment it's just turning it down by a tiny smidgen, but as I bring this up, you can see it's reducing the gain a lot more. So the volume is actually staying completely the same, but we can really hear now in a very neutral way the effect that the clipping is having on the sample. So the name of the game here is just to turn it up until the sample doesn't start to distort. Somewhere around 3 dB there. Now if we turn this off, we can hear the difference between what it would have been like and what it now is like. So again, if we look at the meters, it's not clipping, even though we've managed to turn it up by 3 dB. So we could run that off as well if we want to now. Let's take a look at it, and we can see that it's pushed up. It is clipping, obviously, that's what we were aiming for, but it still sounds more or less exactly the same as it was before, it's just now a lot louder. And so that's one of the ways that we're going to kind of squeeze loudness into our track, is to use that trick across different tracks. So let's just get rid of these guys again, start with a brand new audio track, and we can now start to program our kick pattern. So as I said, we're just going to go for a nice simple pattern. The only thing that we need to be aware of is there is a little bit of a tail here that is kind of creeping over to where the snare would be, which is going to be kind of in this position. So we just need to make sure that they're not overlapping. That's all. Just apply a short fade like that. But now essentially we've got our kick pattern. And now we can go ahead and do exactly the same, but with our snare. So let's just create a new audio track. Let's grab a snare. That one will do. And we're just going to do the exact same thing. So I've saved that clipping rack as a chain, if you like. And so we're just once again going to make sure that the input is selected for the channel that we're on. And then if we just turn these off, we can set the signal back to 0. It must already be at 0. Let's just take a quick look. Yeah, you can see there that one little peak is just brushing up against 0. So let's see now if we can drive this a little bit harder. Now, one way to get around that kind of laggy GPU I mentioned earlier is just to assign this control here to the input gain. So as we bring this up now, it controls that control there, like a macro, but without us having to have the plugin open. So the name of the game is exactly the same. We're just going to be applying some clip gain, driving that signal into the clipper until it kind of falls apart, and just bringing it back a little bit from there. Now, depending on your style, you know, you can really kind of push that hard if you want or not, depending on how important loudness is to the kind of music you're making. But for this kind of genre of drum bass, you want it to be pretty loud. Let's just see how that's looking in our resampling lane. Need to turn off Magic. So yeah, that might be a little bit OTT. That could potentially cause some problems in the mix. So I'm just going to bring that down a little bit more and run it off again. Somewhere around there. That's still like a really nice loud sample that we've got there, without it being kind of overcooked too much. And we can always you know, worry about the mix a bit later down the line as well. For the moment, that is a good kind of starting point. So the next thing we of course now need to do is to start working on some hi-hats and some cymbals. Now, in the interest of time, one of the things I can do at this point is actually to bring in some other content that I've already designed previously. And so, yes, I've got all my kind of cymbals and hats that I've designed, but you can also import different types of content as well. In this case, entire groups. So what I've got here is 2 different lanes of hi-hats. This is a drum rack with all of my hi-hats loaded in. You can hear those. We can see these. These are the original hi-hats that we made earlier. There's a bit of EQ on here, or say a bit of EQ, a lot of EQ, just kind of removing all the bottom end. This is very kind of like high frequency stuff. There's processing, in this case, and again, a filter on the group. And there's a second lane here doing something slightly different. Can't remember what. Just a kind of additional layer. So yeah, not rocket science, but just you know, a way of speeding things up is to kind of store these assets as you make them, and then you can bring them back into your tracks later to kind of get things going more quickly. So similarly, in the interest of speeding up workflow and saving time, I can now bring in some cymbals. I could do that in the same way I've kind of done with the hi-hats, to create a rack, load up some cymbals and kind of program something in MIDI, or even just do it all in audio. I've actually got a cymbal loop that I created here earlier. And really, my aim when I'm kind of designing the cymbal part of the break, or the drum loop in this case, particularly for Dancefloor drum bass, is you almost want to create like a wall or a wash of cymbal noise, and then control it with some kind of either volume automation or ducking to kind of get some pumping. So there's already a little bit of that going on. Let's listen to it. So as you can hear, it's just general. It's almost like white noise mixed in there as well, which is kind of, because of the fact that we've designed a lot of this with kind of, starting with sine waves and using white noise and things like that. But what we can do is kind of just make this a bit more exciting, is to get out the sort of automation pencil on the volume and sort of kind of bring it down when there's like a kick or a snare happening. So something like that, and then kind of just play around with some different patterns like this. And what you're trying to do here essentially is create or recreate that kind of chaotic vibe of a drummer really smashing cymbals and them kind of flying around and the gain kind of leaping out around kind of all over the place. So something like that. Now we can control the gain of this either by sort of doing this, or an easier way perhaps is actually just to group this and then use the gain of the group to do that as well. So let's just play the loop and bring this up. So without really, spending any time on this, I've kind of created a bit of movement just by using volume automation. And at this stage, I'm not really worried about the mix. I'm just kind of getting everything in place, because until I have some bass and some melodic parts and other sort of samples going on, I don't really have any context for where all of this stuff needs to be. So if I start trying to mix it at this stage, I'm just going to be kind of going around in circles. So for now, I'm just quite happy to leave things roughly in place. And then later on, we can look to loop this out, add in some drum fills, playing around with the kick patterns and things like that to kind of build the structure of the track. But as far as making the main beat goes, we've now got the main elements of kicks, snares, hi-hats and cymbals, and that is like 90% of the beat kind of done. So that's it for part one, where we've gone from a basic sine wave like this to making a full beat, looking at some fundamental sound design principles, some of Live's built-in tools, and some great free plugins as well. Stay tuned for part two, where I'm going to turn my attention to designing sub-bass, leads, melodic parts, and a whole bunch of FX, including chords, arps, pads, drones, risers, and more. If you found this series interesting, please do go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the DBS channel, and if you have any questions, let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in part two.